start with today is sex work in India. And sex work in India is particularly, and sex work in general is a very highly researched topic in academia, especially gender studies academia. And part of the reason why it's such a highly studied topic is because of how many debates there are surrounding it. Every group of feminists has a new opinion on it, a different opinion on it, which is slightly different from another opinion. And because of how closely connected it is to trafficking, how closely connected it is to developmental issues, how closely connected it is to issues of unionization, and so on and so forth. So what has happened is that sex work in India is very highly researched. Now, if you are going to talk about how highly researched sex work in India is, it's also important for us to recognize where the hegemonies of sex work research are. So, what do I mean by hegemonies of sex work research? Part of what I actually intend to say is that it's very easy to find a lot of research on sex work, but it's very difficult to find a sex work research related to a certain area or a certain place if that certain area or a place is not Calcutta, Mumbai, or Delhi. Now, why has this happened? Is because within research and within the paradigm of developmental research, there is a tendency to see sex work as the direct result of trafficking. So women get trafficked from catchment areas and get sent to cities where they are kept in brothels and they are forced into quote unquote sex slavery. And this is where sex work research begins. And then you'll have like NGOs working in brothels, and depending on whether you're working from a pro-sex work perspective or whether you're working from an abolitionist paradigm, you will then join the debate. The problem with this is that sex work is not so unidimensional. It is not as unidirectional as a particularly poor area from where girls are trafficked, caught, kidnapped, and then sent to Delhi, Mumbai, Calcutta, Karachi, and then Dubai, which is the Kolkata, Mumbai, Karachi, Dubai route of sex trafficking, as experts talk about it. But it's not as simple as that. Sex work is not just a city-based idea. Excuse me, am I audible? Excuse me?
You are audible, but can you please make it a bit convenient for the listeners?
In what way?
By a bit minimizing your speed, since there are distortions as well. So we can better
Right.
comprehend to your talk when
Right.
you'll consider. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. So what happens is, so what I'm trying to say is sex work is not as one directional as women getting trafficked from a place with low economic development, a rural area to an urban area or an urban center like Calcutta, Mumbai, Delhi, or Chennai. It's far more complicated than that. There is very little complication of the question of from where sex workers come and from where and to what is the reception area of sex work. There is more complication to that question. For example, there is very little work on rural area sex work, very little. Sex work flourishes in almost all small towns. Every small town, whether it has a hospital or not, has a brothel, but there is very little work on that. For example, border areas are replete with brothels, beginning from Petrapol in West Bengal, beginning from the India Maisi Bazaar, which is in the India-Nepal border, beginning from Bashirhat in Bengal. If there are any Bengalis, they would recognize the names that I'm about to drop off. Places like Sandesh Khali, which is near Sundarban. There are plenty of brothels throughout the border areas of Bengal, throughout the border areas with Nepal, even in Kashmir, though it's not a border, may not be brothel-based sex work, but sex work does flourish in these areas. But there is very little research on it other than some reports on trafficking some reports of sex scandals and reports on HIV/AIDS. Very little work. And when I say reports on HIV/AIDS, I mean people basically just talking about like what are the statistics for HIV/AIDS? What are the percentages of workers in such and such places? Beyond that, there is very little information on that. Also notable that sex work need not always be brothel. For example, in southern India, particularly Tirupati, if you have looked at Prabha Kotiswaran's work, who is an academic I'd be referring to repeatedly throughout today's lecture, is Prabha Kotiswaran, as Kotiswaran. She has worked extensively on sex work in South Asia. And if you look at Prabha Kotiswaran's work, she has worked extensively on Tirupati. Several other scholars who have worked on southern India know that brothels are not really a thing in many parts of southern India. The sex workers in southern India are mostly floating sex workers. And out of these floating sex workers, obviously there's a question of intersection there. There are transgender sex workers, there are Dalit sex workers, the child sex workers who are thoroughly trafficked, some of the most exploited of all sex workers, who are forced into the profession. Transgender sex workers particularly are known for working in railway stations, and much of trans sex work, particularly in places like Tirupati, is done in railway station bathrooms, public toilets, and so on and so forth for very little amounts of money. These are some of the highest. These are sex workers with the highest risks of violence, HIV infection, and so on and so forth, and pretty much every other occupational hazard that goes with sex work. These are some of the highest people with the highest vulnerabilities to these problems. Trans sex workers, particularly in southern India as well as in Bengal, they are concentrated in railway stations and areas around railway stations, in slums particularly. If you have read Revati's autobiographical work, you would know that. In Bengal too, sex work, there's a lot of sex work that does go on in railway stations, in slums surrounding railway stations, and so on and so forth. If it's not related directly to the city of Calcutta, there's very little work done on these places. Calcutta particularly holds a hegemony on sex work research because of the incredible work done in Sonagachi, which is one of the largest brothels in Asia, which is just off Shambazar, which is, if you don't know Calcutta, it's in the northern part of the city. It's a very old part of the city, and I'll get to that history later. So, Sonagachi is one of the largest brothels in the country and in Asia itself. And it has thousands and thousands, lakhs of sex workers working in that area. Durbar Mohila Samonnoy Committee, which is the DMSC, was born out of an anti-HIV mobilization, anti-HIV work, dissemination of anti-HIV literature that started in 1991 by a public health expert called Dr. Sarojit Jana. We are community members, people who are active in the activist circuits of Calcutta would obviously know Dr. Sarojit Jana because he's a very well-known face in this part of in Eastern India as far as sex work research is concerned. So DMSC was born out of that, and then what they do is they start following a model which is called the peer education model. That is, they start organizing sex workers into peer groups, and then they designate the literature. They start distributing the literature around HIV prevention, around condom distribution. They start all of these activities. This is obviously in response to the HIV/AIDS crisis, which unfolds in the late 80s and early 90s, which is also partially responsible for a lot of queer mobilizing in India, and in fact, queer mobilizing around the world, including attempts like Queer Nation and so on and so forth. So, what I'm going to do is I'm trying to address these hegemonies. For example, in West Bengal, there's a hegemony of wanting to work in Sonagachi. So, partly why so many scholars are interested in Sonagachi is because it is a very fascinating place. It's also strikingly easy to work with Shonagati, especially for younger researchers like me. All you have to do is to catch hold of your nearest feminist professor. From there, you ask for an introduction to Durbar, and for other similar NGOs like Sonagati is dotted with NGOs. If you have gone to Sonagati, you would know every para more in Sonagati, every turn of a para is a neighborhood. Every neighborhood in Sonagati, every crossing has some kind of NGO office. So if you've been to Sonagati, like what happens is then you talk to a professor, your professor introduces you to some people who work in the NGO, and then you go and do your research in Sonagati. Similar things can be said about Kalighat, or even to some degree Godia, which is also a local nearby red light area in West Bengal, which is also not very well researched. So much of the research around sex work is always done in Sonagati. Another similar problem is experienced when you are going to study bar dancing and its associated debates, and people and then you face the hegemony of Mumbai. So you see Mumbai as the hub of bar dancing, particularly, and because of the caste angle in it, because because of the mobilization that has happened from Mumbai when bar dancing was banned in Mumbai. It's particularly useful, and particularly information on the bar dance circuit in Mumbai is particularly accessible. Bar dancing also happens in Calcutta, and JU Women's Studies is actually doing a project on it, on bar dancers and sex workers in Calcutta, and related West Bengal and so on and so forth. So that kind of sex work. Then there is a sex work of massage parlors, of all of these elite spaces. There's a sex work of escort services and quote unquote all girls that not a lot of people have actually worked in. Street-based sex work holds a hegemony as opposed to elite sex work and all of these other nodes and points where sex work research can happen. It does not happen. So what I'm going to try and do is, before I start on the HIV and related interventions that happened around that time, I'm going to start a little bit on the historical background of sex work, trafficking, and legislation around that time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back in time and try and address a few agreements and so on which took place, which have gone on since the early 20th century. So one of the first agreements that happened with regard, which had anything to do with sex work, prostitution, or even sex trafficking was the 1910 International Convention for the Suppression of White Slave Traffic. So you can understand the colonial underpinning when you use the word white slave traffic, and the anxiety in it to protect white women from sexual aggression, from sexual exploitation, and all of it. So that happened in 1910. In 1949, the UN advances the Convention for the Suppression of Traffic in Persons and the Exploitation of Prostitution of Others, which for nearly 50 years was the sole international treaty on trafficking. In 1949, the convention declared prostitution incompatible with the dignity of the human person, collated prostitution with trafficking, and criminalized acts associated with prostitution and anyone facilitating prostitution, though prostitution itself was not criminalized. Till the 1970s, in international lawmaking, there was a lull. When in the 1970s, global North feminists started addressing questions on anti-trafficking related to sex work tourism in Southeast Asia. And you will know what I'm talking about, places like Thailand, and as well as there was a lot of military stage, American soldiers particularly stationed in various parts of Southeast Asia. So there is a lot of there's a lot of questions about how to handle that. In Nepal and Bangladesh too, women activists highlighted cross-border prostitution. So cross-border prostitution is not something that I'm talking about. It's something that people have woken up to now because of the framework of transnational feminist politics. Cross-border prostitution has been going on, and the primary lens that has always been used to look at cross-border prostitution is trafficking. But that is not so, and that is not so because there are a lot of sex workers who ply their trade across the border. For example, in the Bangladesh Meghalaya border, there is a place called Lal Monir Hut on the Bangladesh side, and there's a river that runs through it. I think the river is called Dharia. So there are sex workers who swim over the Dharia along with other migrant workers. They ply their trade in India and they come back towards the Bangladesh side. And obviously, there's very little research on all of these places. So, and often what happens is when we think of sex work, we think of it in terms of sex slavery, as in somebody's brought and they're sort of like captured and kept in slavery and servitude and they're forced to service customers. But there are a lot of people who do part-time sex work. And I'm not just talking about quote unquote students who are students who are forced into quote unquote call girl services or escort services. Though that is also a major section of these people, there are a lot of working class women who do construction work, who do other kinds of work, for example, domestic work, and they might do sex work on the side. Often what happens is when you are asked them that why you say you choose to do sex work, and you'll see this particularly in cases of mobilized women from collectives and NGOs. If you ask them that why do you say you chose to do sex work, they'll say that if I had to go to construction work or domestic work, I would have to face sexual harassment. And again, if you have read Nalini Jamila's autobiography of a sex worker, you would know what I'm talking about. And construction work often involves a lot of sexual harassment from contractors. So a lot of them will say, I chose to do this because if I'm going to get sexually harassed, I might as well get paid for my sexual labor. So that is a very common answer you will get when you're talking to sex workers, particularly mobilized sex workers. Anyway, back to the point. 1970s, there's a lot of conversation around cross-border sexual trafficking, cross-border sex work.
I'm extremely sorry for disturbing you. Please hold your mic a little bit up so we can share you
closer to the phone. Yeah. Is this better?
Yeah, it's better.
Okay. So then what happens is there's the International Decade of Women. There's a lot of mobilization in the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s. In the 90s, you have the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women, which is in 1994. And the rapporteur later on, it points out that trafficking and sexual trafficking and linking of migration, the delinking of sexual trafficking and migration results in a lot of protection, in better protection of women's human rights, or human rights of women. So this brings us to another point of what I'm trying to say, is that sex work is not just work, it's sex. Part of why women get into sex work is also related to migrations, or related to not having enough opportunities in their homes. For example, if you're living in a village which has been, for example, now that Amphan has happened and so many rural villages areas in West Bengal have been thoroughly affected, if you're living in any of these areas, what you're going to face is that you're going to have to basically be out of a job right now because there's nothing much to do. There's a COVID pandemic raging. So all of this, because of these issues, you will have a massive influx of women trying to get out of their villages. And this was common even when Ayla happened, and in Bangladesh also when Cedar happened. So every time there is any one of these issues, what happens is a lot of people run out of jobs and they try and migrate to other places. In the process of migration, there are agents, there are people who try to get them from these places to cities, middlemen who will take them to a lot of exploitative labor. Now, when I'm talking about, and this is called trafficking. Now, when I'm talking about trafficking, know that I'm not just talking about sex trafficking. trafficking, in order to be addressed seriously and sincerely, absolutely needs to be de-linked from sex trafficking. We think about trafficking, the first word in Bengali that comes to my mind is nari pachar and shishu pachar. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this word. Pachar means to traffic, nari is woman, shishu is children. So trafficking needs to be de-linked. Men get trafficked into very exploitative environments where they are forced to do extremely exploitative hard labor for pittance of a money, often even without paying money. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with Benjamin's fiction, but there's a wonderful book by Benjamin called Goat's Days, where a man from Kerala is sort of trafficked. I wouldn't put a label on it traffic, because it's at the end of the day kept very unclear, but he's basically sent to some unknown place in Saudi Arabia, where he's forced to do incredibly hard labor without a shelter even over his head, and he has to live there and survive. And then he returns to India through a lot of bureaucratic processes and hassle and so on and so forth. But the point I'm trying to make is that trafficking is not necessarily always sex trafficking. Trafficking is related to other forms of human exploitation. Often people will be trafficked for their organs. People will be trafficked into very difficult quarries, into mining spaces and construction businesses. So that stuff happens. So what happens is one of the preliminary solutions to that kind of trafficking is by addressing the need for migration, that people really do want to migrate. If you stop migration, it's going to result in another kind of violence. For example, if you stop migration for women, it's going to result in higher gender violence and gender discrimination. You're going to force them to live with more violence in their hometowns. So you have to address the fact that migration is going to happen. And once you've addressed that, then maybe you can have migration counselors who can then, sort of guide you into into safe migration. Safe migration is important to address sex trafficking and every other form of trafficking. And one NGO that I do know does this work is Jobola, which is a Jobola Action Research Center, which has its branches in various other metropolitan cities in the country. They do that kind of work where they provide counseling for women who want to migrate, or for people who want to migrate, and they provide them helpline numbers to call in case they run into problems. They verify the credentials of employers and so on. That kind of service is incredibly necessary to check hazardous migration. So anyway, another issue that I want to flag here is eventually there's the UN Special Rapporteur on violence against women, and then there's the Palermo Protocol. The Palermo Protocol against UN Convention has three protocols associated with it. Is the UN Convention against Transnational Organized Crime, which in 2000, in the year 2000, and supplemented by three protocols, and amongst them is the protocol to prevent, suppress, and punish trafficking in persons, especially women and children, which is known as the Palermo Protocol. And it came into force in 2004. Encompassed economic exploitation and labor, especially non-consensual, identifies exploitation as the key actionable element, leaving nation states to deal with contentious issues like the definition of sexual exploitation. However, the one critique of the Palermo Protocol is that it increases surveillance on sex workers, and that is a problem with so many of these anti-trafficking laws, is that they increase the surveillance on sex workers. Now, that is the brief international law around sex work that I have given a brief idea. Now, coming back to India, which is one of the first legislation around sex work happened in 1866, which was a Contagious Diseases Act, 1860, brought in England, imposed in England in 1860, imposed in India in 1866. Plenty of abolitionist women campaign against it, and eventually the Contagious Diseases Act is overturned. But the problem remains with the Contagious Diseases Act, and this is going to be a very important is something that this colonial state and later on the post-colonial independent Indian state is also going to address. Is that not address, is going to make this mistake that they constantly see sex workers as carrying contagious diseases, as spreading diseases among soldiers, among colonists during the British era, and so on and so forth. So the Contagious Diseases Act, or the CDA, brought in 1866 in India, is eventually overturned. But the problem is that Josephine Butler was one of the campaigners in 1886. It gets overturned in India. Yeah. So I'm sorry. The earliest regulation of prostitution in India dates back to the 1860s. It's overturned in 1886, not 1866. Sorry. So that happens. The Contagious Diseases Act denotes tries to start the licensing of public women, starts restricting the mobility of prostitutes with venereal diseases. And the biggest problem with this is that firstly there needs to be some talk on the creation of the category of the prostitute. Okay, the prostitute or the sex worker working in an urban brothel is something that has risen out of industrial capital modernity. It is not something the way we understand prostitution, or we understood prostitution before that, was not the incredibly denigrated prostitute of the brothels that we read about in Victorian fiction or similar kinds of fiction that was appearing in India around that time. The Indian understanding of quote-unquote public women were tawaifs and baijis and similar women who maybe, and women in villages who maybe plied sex work on the side. The Indian understanding of prostitution was also an incredibly casteist one. Certain castes, for example, the Nats, the Berias, all of these castes had to perform sex work for the upper castes. Now, this understanding of the Eurocentric understanding of prostitution as city-based sex work happens in the 1860s to 1880s as women who carry diseases, and these bodies are thoroughly stigmatized as carriers of diseases. This problem is something that we'll see reflected again in the HIV crisis, again in the 1950s and the 1980s, 90s, which is the HIV crisis. This is a motive that will continue throughout the entirety of the talk on sex work, even when we start talking about trans sex work. So the CDA comes and goes. Then you have in the 1950s, the Indian government passes something called the SITA, SITA. I always try to remember it as the Sita because it reminds me of the heroine of the Ramayana and the motive of rescue that the Sita tried to put forward. The SITA, the Suppression of Immoral Trafficking in Women and Children Act, which came into usage in India in the 1950s. So the Suppression of Women and Trafficking Act was the result of hardcore lobbying by a lot of women as well, that women are getting trafficked, children are getting trafficked, we need a law to stop this. And a lot of this, obviously, a lot of this activism, never forget, came out of a certain kind of upper caste, middle class morality. That morality resulted in acts like CETA, which eventually in the 1980s gets named ITP, or the Immoral Trafficking Prevention Act. Now, when the CETA was being passed in 1955, in the 1950s, it was passed in 1956, and in 1958, you have a woman called in Allahabad called Husna Bai, who goes to the Allahabad High Court, files a petition and says, I am a prostitute, and this act, the SITA, is against my right to work. It's against my constitutional freedom. And this she is doing in 1958 in Allahabad. And people are absolutely astounded. They have no idea how to deal with a woman who says that sex work is my right. And this is not an isolated incident. Similar protests happen in Mumbai. In Calcutta, around the same time, 13,000 women had risen up, and they had demanded alternative livelihoods for if CETA came into being. None of their attention, none of their questions, none of their issues, none of their concerns were addressed by the state. None of it at all was taken seriously. In the 19 when does the state actually start taking sex workers seriously is in the late 1980s, early 1990s, when the state is afraid of HIV, when there's international pressure mounting, when the Indian state has just liberalized and there's international, or about to liberalize before that, and there's international pressure mounting that you need to curb this epidemic. Then they get concerned as sex workers are seen as the bodies which transmit infection to men, and from there to other women, who will then transmit into upper caste middle class society, and like the bourgeois society in general. Then they start getting worried about sex workers. Before that, sex workers had never been the target of any kind of labor-based, rights-based programs. For example, they had always been the target of rescue, but they were never the target of any human rights based programs. For example, in 1958, one of the primary allegations that concerns that Husnabai had raised was that this was against the structure of the welfare state structure of the Indian state, of the Indian constitution, and Husnabai's concerns were dismissed. So that was 1950s. Now, why am I talking about the 1950s as important is because you have to, as I was saying, that the history of sex work in India is a long one. And particularly history of sex work activism and organization in India is a long one. And as far as we know for certain, specifically in Calcutta, and I'm sorry my talk is becoming more and more Calcutta focused, but that is my area and that is the place from West Bengal particularly, and I have the most access of information from Calcutta, again due to a certain kind of academic hegemony which I am also guilty of perpetuating. So anyway, part of why you could have 13,000 sex workers mobilized in Calcutta in the 1950s and claim that they wanted alternative livelihoods was because sex work in Calcutta was three-tiered in the 1920s. So between 1920s and 1950s, you had a three-tiered basis of sex work. How do we know this? Because there is one report from the 1920s from Rangoon by Shuttleworth, who was the superintendent of police there, who had claimed that there were three kinds of sex workers available in Calcutta. The primary kind of sex workers in Calcutta were the Europeans, the biggest market, the highest rated, so to speak, were Europeans, mainly Southern Russians, and Anglo-Indians. The brothels were organized and in charge. Were organized and in charge of madams who appropriated half the earnings of the girls in return for board and lodging. Customers were only Europeans, and the most important area for European prostitution was Koraya Road near Baliganj. And these brothels, these areas were under strict police supervision. There was a lot of surveillance. Number two, the second kind of sex work in Calcutta in the 1920s were the Japanese girls who catered to sailors. And again, this is also the start of our fetish, not start, the earliest mention of our fetishism with Northeastern and Asian looks East Asian looks that I could find in my research on sex work. And primarily, these brothels, which employed Japanese women, were located in the suburbs of Watganj and Khidirpur. Khidirpur, if you know, is a very well-known port area, and the Khidirpur docks are still active now, used to be even more active back then. Police supervision was more or less lax. The third kind of prostitution or sex work that was common in Calcutta was the sex work of Indian women or Bengalis and similar women from surrounding Calcutta, which catered to Indians only. The areas were Sonagachi, Chitpur, and Beedon Square, and this is all in North Calcutta, the old part of the city. According to the report, there was hardly any control by the police. The police in general had very little control in these areas, and most of these women came from Medinipur, Bardhaman, Bankura, Bihar, and the United Provinces, which is now Uttar Pradesh, and a pattern consistent with the patterns of labor migrations. So also important to note at this point in the 1920s is that a Calcutta underworld had emerged, including people like what we call gundas. The gunda figure had already emerged in Calcutta in the 1920s, and it were these men who were regulating sex work. It was these men who were regulating opium and cocaine trafficking, and so on and so forth. So there was no police surveillance. There was a lot of women employed in Chitpur, Sonagachi, and all these areas, and there was an underlying gunda culture, culture of political. The gundas were under political leaders even in pre-independent India. A part of them had also participated in the riots in 1946. So the Hindu-Muslim riots in 1946, but that's a separate discussion. So the city brothel, as we imagine it, as a hub of like underground activities beginning from political figures to gundas to sex workers, pimps. This had already formed in the 1920s, and out of this, the agitation emerges in the 1950s. 1950s agitation over, no attention paid to by the state. The state only starts paying attention to sex workers in the 1980s and late 1980s, early 1990s, particularly from 1991 onwards, when sex workers sort of command a kind of biopower over the state when it comes to HIV, because now they are stigmatized as the carriers of HIV, but the state is also in a sense afraid of them, that they're going to spread it if you don't control them. And at this time, you realize that there's an essay called HIV is Our Friend by a scholar called Lakim Sethi. So at this point, you realize that that the state realizes, and the welfare workers, for example, NGOs and so on, realize that HIV is not the concern of sex workers. Sex workers are concerned about gunda violence. Sex workers are concerned about exploitation and all of these other occupational hazards that they regularly have to deal with. In the 1990s, so there is this silent negotiation between sex workers and welfare activists, sex workers and government workers. Sex workers claim sex workers will only be interested in HIV prevention if you address all these other issues that they have to deal with. That is, they have to deal with police violence, they have to deal with gunda violence, they have to deal with sexual exploitation. So if you only address those issues, will they be bothered about the HIV epidemic? So, and lots of sex workers have actually said this, that like HIV becomes a sort of bargaining tool in the 1990s for dealing with sex work, for sex workers. So another problem that the NGOs face when they go to do that kind of developmental work in the brothels is that they realize that sex work is easy, it's far easier for customers to find. It's far easier to say that condoms are a compulsion than actually to implement it. So what happens is that if the sex worker, if one sex worker says that I'm not going to ply my trade, I'm not going to have sex if you do not use a condom, then the customer goes to the next sex worker who is willing to have sex without a condom, and in fact sex without condom pays more than sex with condoms. So what they do is, in the 1990s, is that then they realize that we have to unionize the sex workers. That is, we have to create a culture where all of them at the same time say that we are not going to have sex without condoms, which is something they could do in Sonagachi successfully. Which is why the Sonagachi project is so well known, is because they could distribute condoms for free or at very low prices between sex workers, and could unionize them into saying that we will not have sex without condoms. Why do women get unionized? Part of the reason why sex workers do get unionized is that, number one, because of the protection and because of the support from peer groups that you get. And remember, when I'm talking about support for peer groups, I'm not just saying that you get support in terms of HIV prevention, or you get support in terms of STI clinics and so on. You also get support when your madam is beating you up, when the brothel owner is torturing you, or when the police have arrested you for no good reason. So at that point, your peer educator or your peer group is going to show up with you to the police station. At that point, nobody else is going to be there, but that particular peer group from that NGO you have gotten mobilized under, or the sex workers collective you have gotten mobilized under. So that is why that is one of the huge reasons why women get inclined, sex workers get inclined to that kind of peer support protection that these collectives can provide. Again, another reason why they get mobilized is because NGOs and developmental activities provide them a extra income also. So if you do good work and you manage to become part or start working for any of these NGOs, then you get paid, which is in a sense class mobility for you. So all of these incidents, all of these this phenomenon has been documented by various other scholars. So that happens in the NGO circuits in NGO's brothels in Kolkata. That happens in a lot of other places. Meanwhile, in the 2000s, the other important development that happens in the field of sex work is the ban in bar dances in Mumbai. Is that the activity of dancing itself is criminalized. The selling of alcohol is not banned. The bars are not banned. The dancing in bars is banned because it refuses, and this is because it's the excuse used by the government is that you are being particularly you are destroying morality and so on and so forth. So now who are the women who danced in these bars? The women who danced in the bars in Bombay were from very lower caste communities, Dalit Bahujan communities. Part of the reason why the state bans bar dance or bar dancing is because they are so afraid of the sexuality of these women. And they're afraid because now these women who are Dalit women who were forced to dance or who are forced to provide sexual services to upper caste men are now getting paid for it. And this is particularly a problem that the state has had with sex work forever, is the payment in terms of in return for sex work, when for men, for cishet men particularly, sex is supposed to be free. So suddenly you have to pay these women to have sex with them. And particularly problematic in the case of caste, because now these women are commodifying their labor, they're selling their labor and they're demanding a price for it. So again, what happens, and Prabha Kotiswaran has written in great detail about it. There's an essay that she's written. If you want, I'll send it over to you, in which she claims that throughout the entire bar dance debate of the 2000s, the one occupation that was always the other to bar dancing was sex work. So you went on saying that if you do not allow these women to bar dance, they will eventually have to go and take up sex work. They'll actually have to go and do something else. So particularly sex work, something more denigrating, quote unquote. That is the problem with the debate. Certainly that Kotiswaran points out right. The other problem with the state stopping bar dance is that they have not stopped prostitution. They have not stopped forced prostitution. They have not stopped any of these other activities related to sex work that are actually needs to be stopped. For example, child trafficking, or obviously in legal terms they have stopped child trafficking, but related there are laws against these activities, but these activities mostly go unchecked in many parts of India. So there is in many parts of Maharashtra itself. So it's not like you have stopped taking extra steps to stop these other activities. You have only stopped bar dancing because you believe that it is spreading a certain kind of immorality. Another, and this has been pointed out by scholars, that then the problem the state has with women in Dalit Bahujan women doing bar dancing is not the commodification of Dalit Bahujan bodies, but the fact that these women are commanding a price for it. You would be very happy if they would end up in brothels, or they would end up in far riskier professions You would be very happy if they were, you would not have a problem if they were forced into far riskier professions, if they were forced into prostitution. And I'm using the word prostitution as opposed to sex work in this context. You would be far happy if, you wouldn't have a problem if they were forced into any of these activities. But you have a problem that they're dancing in a bar and making money out of it. And a lot of them were actually making a lot of money. For example, a lot of Nat women, a lot of Beria women, for example, all of these women who used to work in Maharashtra from the performer castes, where women traditionally engage in sex work once they grow older, in their villages would have to work for very pittance of prices. But once they come to Mumbai, this was bar dancing was an attempt for them to get some amount of class mobility. And remember that along with bar dancing, there were a lot of other associated industries. For example, tailoring. For example, ornaments, imitation ornaments that these women would wear when they were dancing. All of these other professions that imitate a certain Bollywood style. All of these activities get a certain kind of a setback. So a lot of people lose their jobs, including the bar dancers who mobilize. And obviously, there has been a lot of criticism from Dalit feminists on bar dancing, very legitimate criticism that of the gaze that's present on the body of the bar dancer, the upper caste male gaze, and so on. But the bar dancers themselves mobilize and organize and say that no, we this is our profession, we need this work. Similar attempts happen in Calcutta. Similar attempts always happen in Calcutta. In fact, those first May on 31st April, when they say that we basically demanding labor rights for sex workers, and the resounding তোর খাটিয়ে খাই শ্রমিকের মর্যাদা চাই, which is also a slogan that was raised in Pride last in 2000. Particularly working class connotation attached to it. You you say working class women. So gotor khatiye khai, as in I use my I work my body. There's a lot of work involved in sex work. So gotor khatiye khai shromiker morjada chai. So I want the recognition of a laborer. So that is a resounding slogan in West Bengal's brothels, particularly in Calcutta brothels, where mobilization has taken place. Another resounding slogan that again popularized by Durbar is that transphobia as well as quote unquote whorephobia, which is basically the denigration of sex work, related to the denigration of sex work. So in now you'll have the citizenship rights for sex workers that people are now talking about. You have the COVID pandemic, which is completely destroying sex work, because it's something that has to happen at a very intimate level. You can't social distance and have sex work. So it's very difficult for women in sex work right now. And the other thing that I'm really concerned about that might challenge sex workers is the climate crisis, because I'm not sure how many of you have read it, but the one brothel in Bangladesh is completely going under. It's completely being gobbled up by a river, a place called Bani Shanta or Bani Shanta, I'm not sure, in Bangladesh. where the river keeps breaking the banks and gobbling up the brothel, and the women there are in very precarious conditions. So climate change might very well affect sex workers, and that is a very understudied area of research in gender studies. Uh, there are several other such activities that might pose threats to sex workers. Uh, COVID, Amphan, Aila, all of these have affected sex workers in West Bengal. I am yet to find out what the pandemic has done to sex workers in Mumbai and Delhi. But yeah, that's basically it. There is a far more amount of information in my notes, but I don't think I can even start talking about that. I would much rather entertain questions and see how I can sort of address your issues and so on. Thank you.
Thanks, Ekavali, for this wonderful lecture. It is very much helpful for us to understand, and society should know about the fact. And it is also, you are, I feel like you are highlighting those portions there, how this misogynistic, patriarchal, and orthodox societies discriminating and suppressing way to the people, to the way to the human, I should say human, because I am including here queers also as well as females, because they're completely intersectional. And if we taking into knowledge about Durkheim, that the suicide theory, that everything is a system operation, so operation of system. So if I want to be a sex worker, it is not my icha, like it's not my chaha that I want to be a sex worker or whatever. It is a force from the society, that society makes me a sex worker. And there's no harm to do sex work because I am selling my labor. And I have the right to sell that. The problem is, I feel the problem is those the people, those who are buying this work, the called so-called babu. So it's like there is a rule in France. You might know about that rule. Like there is not sex work, not is a ban there. That is completely legal, and government give all the facility to all sex workers. But it is illegal to buy a sex work. You're getting my point.
Right. Yeah, I'm getting your point. The bigger problem with that is exactly what the Indian government tried to do in 2005 and 6, which is when sex workers mobilized and said that this will challenge our livelihood. One of the larger problems with theorization around sex work is that, and this is true, sex workers barely ever look at male sexual desire from a critical angle. So Nalini Jamila, in her autobiography, writes that yeah, men will be men. Male sexual desire is irrepressible, irrepressible, and it's inevitable. So they will want to have sex, and we are only giving a certain service that there is a demand for. And if we do not provide this service, we act as scavengers in society. If we do not provide this service, men will go around pinching and molesting other women, which is the underlying issue is that they are not theorizing male sexual desire as something that need not be inevitable. So that angle is there. The bigger problem, I think, the bigger concern regarding that kind of activity and the reason why sex workers take to that kind of rhetoric is they're constantly under threat of the shutdown of their jobs. So they're constantly under threat that if men are criminalized, then they will lose their livelihood, which is a valid point. Coming to, I think that is one of the reasons why they constantly depend on this rhetoric that there is a demand for it, we are only supplying it. And which is also why they constantly have issues with any attempt to stop that demand by the states. There's also the other concern is that it might drive sex work underground. If customers are criminalized, then it might drive sex work underground, which is also a very valid point. The other, to address the first part of your question, that you become sex workers out of oppression. Right. I mean, obviously, Bhadralok women, middle class women, barely ever have to undergo situations in life when the only means of work for them would be sexual labor. the only means of earning money for them would be sexual labor. Sexual labor is also involved in marriage, but definitely. But the bigger problem why the trafficking discourse will never work with respect to addressing sex work is because the borders between forced sex work and consensual sex work is very blurred. You never know what is forced by oppression and what is consensual. Often a lot of women, many sex workers have been forced into sex work because of the horrible conditions prevailing in construction work, in domestic work, which is also very caste based work. Domestic work is incredibly caste based and incredibly pointless. And I'll get to that later. The border between oppressive work, so these women know, they are very aware that their situation is oppressive, but they're doing the best that they can in that oppression, and that they consider their choice. And to even use the rhetoric of choice when they talk about sex work has a certain kind of performative empowerment to it. When you say that this was my choice, for example, in Pride, if you were there in Calcutta Pride, you remember somebody took the microphone and shouted, "Gotor khatiye khai shromiker morjada chai." There is it was a very performative, very empowering moment, precisely because of the performance associated with it. To say, and I remember I had attended a workshop between women who work in the field and sex workers. So two kinds of working women, and non-sex worker working women were constantly like, sex workers steal our husbands, and the sex workers went on saying, this is our choice, it is our choice of work. And there is a performative element to saying that this is my choice. It makes you feel empowered, even though that choice is always informed by hundreds of other oppressive structures.
Actually, we can see in a movie in Tollywood that I think Rate Rajinigonda, performed by Rituparna Sengupta, where Rituparna becomes a sex worker like on the operation of the society.
Is this the one which is set in Sundarban?
No. That is Tan,
Tan,
Jalbesha.
right. Yeah.
Not that. Another one is that is about Sonagachi, and
Right.
done by again Rituparna Sengupta, and name is Rate
Right.
Rajinigonda. So
Right.
they're saying like they're completely telling about this societal oppression and discrimination, how middle class women become a sex worker, the journey from a middle class woman to
Right.
become a
The journey, the sex work business, which is dominated by housewife who do part-time sex work, or people in massage bars, in escort businesses and call girl services in Calcutta, that is severely underworked. There is very little information, and that it's a very secretive line of work, and particularly because particularly because researchers actually find it very difficult to sort of navigate that space and actually do research in those areas. But that is a very underworked area, which is something that gender studies researchers must start working on. They need to start working on that area in Calcutta and related fields. The middle class women in housework, sex work through pornographic sites. All of that needs to, it's very important that we start work on that.
Yeah. So we should go for a couple of questions from the audience. But before that, I have an announcement to audience. Please be
Right.
humble with your language, because I noticed certain of comment that is very much vulgar comment, and I am not expecting this kind of comment from the rounded participants, those who are doctors, professors. This is very much pathetic for our webinar. Sorry to say. So the first question is from Rupesh Kumar Manu, and Rupesh is asking about how will you differentiate? How will you differentiate bar dancers and brothel prostitutes? Which method will you apply? What would be your suggestions whether a bar dancer joins sex or not? Please exemplify.
I can't suggest whether a bar dancer should or should not join sex work or not. But a bar dancer, like I said, lines between bar dancing and brothel sex work have become blurred since bar dancing was banned. A lot of women were actually forced into brothel sex work. when I talk about bar dancing in Mumbai per se, I'm referring to a lot of bars where women were specifically dancing to entertain the audience. I am not talking about red light areas, for example, in Lahore or early 20th century red light areas where women would be dancing and entertaining as well as having sex all together in that the space of the tawaif. I'm not addressing that. I'm talking about specifically professional bar dancing and related sex work that would happen in Mumbai. And that line has brothel sex work and bar dancing line has gotten blurred later on, but there were actually dance bars in Mumbai which were thoroughly incarcerated, and like the women were taken, jobs were taken away from the women, and so on and so forth. As I said.
Thanks. Another question is from Priyam Ghosh, and Priyam is asking, should we follow the same model by nations like Australia, Bangladesh, France, legalize sex work in India, will providing legality dis- stigmatize issues around sex work and address issues of livelihood, or will it still remain a legality versus morality debate?
Huh. Look, Bangladesh has about 20 legalized brothels, but the problem with Bangladeshi brothels is that even when they're legalized, they have terrible human rights records. And I'm talking about Daulat Diya, I'm talking about Bani Shanta, all of these brothels, they have terrible human rights records. And even with legalization. And in fact, one particular brothel was burnt down by goons from the Awami League a few years ago because they wanted to reclaim land. And then workers agitated, so they had to build the brothels. They wanted to basically steal the land from the sex workers, and they agitated, and they had to build another brothel. They had to build buildings all over, and I don't know in the entire process how much land was lost by the sex workers. Uh, Australia. So there is a difference between legalization and decriminalization. Sex workers organizations in India demand decriminalization, not legalization. Decriminalization is the decriminalization of sex work. Legalization would entail a lot of lawmaking around sex work, which would result in more surveillance and more control of sex work. The demand in India is to decriminalize it, and that's it. The demand in India, largely by progressive sex workers or organizations, is not to legalize sex work. The two words have to be differentiated carefully when we are talking about sex work in an academic context.
Thanks. Another question from Sarita Sethi. Sapna Sarita is asking how to face problem sex worker by upper caste.
Sorry, could you
How to
repeat?
face problem sex worker by upper caste.
I'm not particularly sure what it means, but say there is a caste division in sex workers. If you go and search, even if you do a survey of sex work in brothels in red light areas where there is not a lot of discussion about casted sex work, even then you would find that a large part of the people who come to these brothels, who work in these brothels, are Dalit Bahujan women. And that is partly because the vast majority of India's working classes are made by Dalit Bahujan people, which is something that the communists have never been able to address properly in India, something that Ambedkarites have tried to address repeatedly. And it's true that sex work is a very casted profession in India. And it's also true that the bodies of sex workers are often, even within Dalit discourses, the bodies of sex workers are often controlled by Dalit men. And it's also true that sex workers, but the Ambedkarite discourse is also true in that upper caste men have used Dalit women for sex work, and the gaze is constantly directed at the Dalit woman's body, which is what I was trying to say when I was talking about the Mumbai bar dance situation. It's also true that Dalit men, as they have become more upwardly mobile, have been incredibly uncomfortable with the sex work histories of Dalit women, with the history of sex work of their mothers, and so on. And also, at the same time, it's also true that their mothers did suffer incredible amounts of violation. So it's not a black and white discourse. It's a discourse by discourse by discourse. So it's something that has to be understanding has to be very very nuanced. At the same time, we also have to address trans sex workers. Again, a lot of them Dalit Bahujan. Again, a lot of them belonging to very marginalized trans identities. Things like Londa dancing, things like Kotis, who often are not considered trans enough in queer discourses. So again, dominated by lower caste working class people. So you have to be very careful about whose job you are taking away when you are making an abolitionist argument about sex worker work sitting in your AC academic room, even if you belong to like a certain Dalit Ambedkarite situation, and even as I belong to a certain Savarna progressive sort of disposition, I need to be very careful about what I say and the discourse I promote, because I won't be the one facing the brunt of the violence of sex work, right? At the end of the day, that violence will be faced by so many other people. So, yeah.
Thanks again, Kapoli. Next question is, how do you relate to partial reading down of Section 377 and surveillance of trans sex work and cursing space, pushing space?
Right. Uh, Look, the NASA judgment did provide space for self assignation of gender identity. Following that, the TG bill came out, and it was very evident that what the government was trying to do with the TG bill was to medicalize, was to further biologize uh, sex work sorry, transgender identities. You had to have an operated on, you had to change your penis into a vagina if you had to call yourself a trans woman. And by doing that, they were very obviously trying to also create another industry, a medical industry for sexual sex change operations and so on. So and they were trying to criminalize begging, they were trying to criminalize hijra peshas, hijra britti as we call it in Bengali. All of these professions that they were trying to criminalize, it's very obvious that they were trying to create a narrative of, they were trying to gentrify the transgender community. And part of the transgender community did fall for it, the more privileged middle class ones, but very large sections of it did not actually buy it, which is why Pride before last 2018 Pride, there was a huge demonstration against TG bill by transgender people. They had gone to Delhi also to do that. So the even during the lockdown, what the government is doing right now is sending activists copies of the rules of the Transgender Act and telling them that you give us your suggestions on the act now. And everybody is in pandemic mode. Nobody is in contact with anybody. People can't convene meetings. And in the middle of this, they ask activists to give their opinion on the rules of the Transgender Act. So it's a very sinister program by the Indian state that is being perpetrated on transgender folks. And even more unfortunate is that a lot of queer people are actually falling for it.
Thanks. Hello. Am I audible?
Hello. Yeah, you are.
Yeah. So I would like to ask the audience if they have. I think there's some big questions and which is kind of descriptive. So I'd like to ask everyone if you have. Then you can raise your hand. Then our host can unmute you and you can directly have a talk with Ekaboli.
Yeah, of course.
That will be better. So host, can you unmute Sneha Rai Chaudhary? Sneha has some questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can you hear me, Ekavali?
Yeah, I can.
Yeah. Okay. So, what I was asking is that, um, in terms of crimes that sex workers are subjected to, in a
Right.
lot of ways, the crimes are not reported because systems are not in place to protect it.
Right.
Or protect them. And in a lot of ways, when you try putting these systems in place, it would also then, like you said, mean that it would have an effect on, um, you know, on their business, on the way they, you know, on overall incomes, basically,
Right.
livelihoods and income. So like, leaving aside the way the state looks at this through morality, or even through decriminalization, like, how would what would be the path forward, irrespective, to provide resources which safeguard all kinds of sex workers from sexual or physical crimes,
Violence.
without, exactly, violence, and without um, you know affecting their overall incomes or the way they operate.
I think the first thing that needs to be addressed in this context is police violence. Part of why sex workers don't go to police stations is because policemen actually rape them when they go there, and this might not be very common or like very well known in mobilized brothels in Calcutta, but this has happened. There are allegations, no, there are mentions of things like that in journals and autobiographies. There's an incident that Revati describes where the policeman rapes her. Part of the first thing that needs to be curbed in that context is police violence and the association of police with gundas and pimps. That's a well-oiled machinery, and that needs to stop. The first people who should be responsible in that situation is the state itself. There is so much the state can do to safeguard the lives of sex workers without actually ruining their livelihoods. But the state is bent on ruining their livelihoods first. So that's the first thing. The second thing that can be done is extensive migration counseling. Because if trafficking needs to be handled properly, then people need then migration has to be addressed. So if people will want to migrate, especially in a country like India, you where literacy levels, education awareness levels are low, you will have to give them proper counseling about migration, which employers are legit, which employers will not sell you off to some place dangerous, be it a brick kiln, be it a construction site, be it a brothel. That kind of migration counseling needs to absolutely happen. Uh, Other than that, the other thing that needs to absolutely happen, and that is actually done by a lot of NGOs, is when women do come to brothels, they're provided counseling services to decide whether they want to stay in the brothel or they want to get out of the business. That choice, it may not sound like a very good choice, especially because your body has already been stigmatized if you're in the brothel, and if you're not a virgin anymore, quote unquote, virgin by normative standards, as in vaginal sexual intercourse, you're already stigmatized. But some amount of choice needs to be given for women in alternative avenues of work. The problem with alternative avenues of work is that domestic work does not even earn half of what sex work makes women. Construction work is even worse. And some white feminists and other feminists as well, radical feminists like what was this woman's name? O'Connell something. I forget her name. Anyway, so a lot of them have pointed out that radical feminists that sex work does not have any social value to it. But the point is that even in India, forget India, domestic work has no social value to it. Domestic work is basically the outsourcing of work that Savarna women and Savarna men will not do. Domestic work is the outsourcing of work that white men and white women will not do because they have other things to do, because society has given them a certain amount of privilege. And that work is out, and even when that work is outsourced to a lot of to Dalit women, to Hispanic Latina women, to Black women in the United States. So what value does that work have? That you are a nanny. Even Malayali women who go to or Indian women who go to the Gulf, you're a nanny in some rich person's house, and you don't have any association with your own. Like you cannot afford to associate with your own children. You cannot provide them the love and care that you want to give them. So that doesn't have any social value either. But sex work is unduly stigmatized and unduly assessed repeatedly as not having social value by so many other feminists, radical feminists, by the state, and so on and so forth. So even an alternative means of livelihood have to be provided to sex workers. They have to be proper paying livelihoods. You cannot pay a domestic worker 500 rupees a month and expect sex work to go away from the country. It will not happen. You have to make the commitment. Even when governments, states are addressing, making all these ridiculous rehabilitation skills where they teach women knitting and whatnot, like Victorian aunties, you have to provide them actual job opportunities that will pay them minimum wage. You cannot have ask sex, it is terribly entitled to ask sex workers to leave a job that actually pays them more than a domestic work which will pay them like 2000 rupees a month, or knitting, which god knows how much that pays them. It's absolutely ridiculous. I'm sorry, I get very passionate about this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ekavali. The next question is, what would be your take on work of popular culture that claims to empower or celebrate sex work?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. The problem with if you're talking, for example, I'm going to refer to Bollywood here, where there's like this whole uh, phenomenon of item numbers which are performed by a certain kind of like the stereotype of the bar dancing sex worker. So you will have movies like, I don't know what was that movie, the Salman Khan movie, where like Munni Badnaam Hui and like Sheila Ki Jawani and all these item numbers where women will put their bodies up for display and they will dance, and they that and in certain cases that is also shown as empowerment. Um, you will have no, there was one particular character I remember in this 2000s movie called Gangster, where Kangana Ranaut played a bar dancer. The underlying question you are not addressing is caste. When Vidya Balan played Silk Smita, Vidya Balan is a Tamil Brahmin. When Silk Smita was a Dalit Bahujan person, I think Bahujan. Anyway, she was dark skinned, but when Silk Smita's career is gentrified and commodified for consumption of the middle and the upper castes in India, the woman and Silk Smita becomes an object of empowerment, even though that empowerment is a very problematic empowerment as shown in the movie itself. Movie is pretty problematic, but when Silk Smita becomes gentrified, Silk Smita's role has to be played by a Brahmin woman. If you see the number of women who make like these item numbers and dance steps and all of these, the ones who get paid well out of it are all upper caste women, or they're fair skinned, and if they're not upper caste, so they're definitely upper class. Like Katrina Kaif may be Muslim, but she is very fair skinned, and she has had a considerably privileged upbringing. Uh, the same goes for like Kangana Ranaut is again very fair skinned, thorough bhak, but like, you get what I'm trying to get at, is that the privilege in the reality of actual sex workers who work on the street or who engage in the hazardous profession is very different from the women who portray them on screen, or women who engage in a certain performative empowerment on screen through the avenue of sex work or through the avenue of the displaying of bodies.
Thank you. Another question is from Alex. Alex asked you that what problems are faced by sex workers, especially through upper caste.
Problems faced by sex workers, especially if they are upper caste.
Yes.
This is not something I have looked at in great detail. This is a very interesting question. But I would think that a lot of them would be in a very Savarna bourgeois Brahminical form of morality. And my guess would be that they would have problems with their families if they came out with the fact that they are a sex worker. So the hiding and leading of the double life could be a problem. But this is a very interesting question, and I'd look at it in greater detail.
Yeah. Another question is, what steps can be taken to provide financial well-being to sex workers?
One step that has already been taken in West Bengal is by Durbar, where they have unionized them and they have arranged for banking services for them. What used to happen previously is that they would sex workers would keep their money with their madams or their pimps, who would then not give them. They would be cheated out of their money every now and then. I think Durbar, along with like a network of other organizations that work with sex workers, they started a service called Usha, which also deals to a certain degree with banking, provides banking facilities for women. So you have to keep that money in a bank, and in order to have a bank account, you need to have some form of an identity card, and an identity card also means citizenship of the state. Now that is possible for women in India who are living in brothels, but it's very difficult for trafficked women who are getting sent off to brothels in India, or women engaged in cross-border sex work. It's very difficult for them to have to have identity cards to save money. So it's a very interesting question. Thank you.
Is there any new questions? Please raise your hand. Host will unmute you. Uh, I think there is no more questions from the audience. I'm thanking to you, Ekabuli, for raising this topic here. We need to know about uh, these things because in this patriarchal society, we need to talk about this. Otherwise,
Yeah.
it is going to be a continuous orthodox or like bigotry society. We need to break this system. So thanks for
Right.
this. And another thing is, I want to tell to audience that we don't have any notions to break anyone's morality or anyone's belief or whatever. We just want to talk about the fact which is hidden under this, which is suppressed or which is discriminated by this patriarchal society. That's it. This is my point of view, and it is also our point of view that we we don't harm or breaking any kind of morality of anyone's. That's completely personal choice of them. So thank you, Ekavali, again for this nice and wonderful presentation and this lecture. We get to know about a lot. I have
Welcome.
lot of questions.
Thanks for providing the opportunity, and it was very nice to talk to you all. And did you say you had a question?
Yeah, but
Did
can
you
you
say you had a
repeat it?
question?
I say I have, but I'll ask you through phone call. That will be better. Otherwise, it will be a
Okay, sure,
long
sure. Oh,
discussion because
yeah,
we have
definitely,
next
definitely.
speakers also.
Yeah.
So we
Oh.
are going to take. Yeah. Tell me.
No. I said obviously it's. We are going to have the discussion over phone later.
Yeah. Of course. Our next session will be like the next speaker is Anmol. So we'll start after 10 minutes. We are going to take a 10 minutes break. Please don't go and don't break this platform. Please be there, and we'll come back after 10 minutes. That will be better. Please don't cut out this line. Thank you. That
Okay.
is my
Thank you.
announcement.
Okay. Bye bye.
Bye.